The massive warship Stellar Dawn floated in the darkness of space like a metal city. Inside its main briefing room, 12 different alien species had gathered around a holographic display that showed their target. The room buzzed with strange languages and the sounds of breathing from creatures that came from worlds far from Earth. General Zethkar stood at the center of it all. He was nearly 8 feet tall with dark green scales that covered his reptilian body. His yellow eyes scanned the room with the confidence of someone who had won 100 battles. The Vrex Empire had ruled this part of space for over 3,000 years, and Zethkar was one of their most feared commanders. The hologram showed a fortress built into an asteroid. It belonged to a group of rebels who had been attacking Coalition supply ships for months. The fortress was heavily armed and protected by energy shields that could stop most weapons. Getting inside would not be easy. The attack will begin at dawn cycle, Zethkar announced in his deep, growling voice. My Vrex shock troops will lead the main assault on the primary entrance. The ethereal tech specialists will disable their communication arrays. The Mantid warriors will secure the outer perimeter. He pointed to different sections of the fortress as he spoke. Each alien species nodded when their role was mentioned. They were all experienced fighters who had worked together before. All, except for one group. The briefing room doors opened with a soft hiss. Captain Lisa Cameron walked in first, followed by 5 human soldiers in standard Coalition uniforms. They were smaller than most of the aliens in the room. Their skin was soft and pale compared to the armored hides and metal plates of their allies. They carried simple projectile weapons instead of the energy blasters that other species preferred. General Zethkar barely looked at them. "Ah yes, the humans have finally arrived," he said with what might have been amusement. Several of the other alien commanders made sounds that could have been laughter. Captain Cameron stood straight and saluted. Captain Cameron reporting for briefing, sir. My team is ready for assignment. Zethkar's yellow eyes moved over the human soldiers with obvious disappointment. They looked so fragile compared to the massive Krillian berserkers or the swift Zephyrian scouts. He had read the reports about human capabilities. They were weak, slow, and had poor natural armor. Their technology was centuries behind most Coalition members. The only reason they had been allowed to join the Coalition at all was because they reproduced quickly and were willing to fight in battles that other species considered too dangerous. "Very well," Zethkar said, turning back to the hologram. "The human contingent will be assigned to secondary objectives. While the real warriors handle the main assault, you will infiltrate the lower levels and attempt to disable the power grid." One of the human soldiers stepped forward slightly. He was average height for his species with brown hair and steady dark eyes. His uniform identified him as Sergeant Jake Martinez. Unlike his captain, he did not salute or show any sign of being impressed by the towering alien general. "Sir, I've studied the fortress layout," Jake said in a calm voice. "The power grid is heavily defended. The approach route you've marked goes through 3 separate kill zones. My team could handle it, but the timeline seems tight. If we had an additional 15 minutes to—" "Sergeant Martinez," Captain Cameron said sharply, but Jake continued speaking. "If we coordinated our attack to begin 30 minutes after the main assault, we could use the distraction to avoid the automated defenses. The power grid has backup systems that take time to activate. We could—" General Zethkar raised one clawed hand for silence. The room went quiet. When he spoke, his voice carried the tone of someone explaining something to a small child. "Sergeant, is it? Let me explain something to you. This is a military operation, not a discussion group. I have been commanding fleets since before your species discovered fire. The Vrex Empire has conquered more worlds than your entire race has ever seen. Do you really believe that you, a soft-shelled creature from a backwards planet, understand tactics better than I do?" The other alien commanders made sounds of agreement. A few of them stared at Jake with what looked like pity. The idea that a human would question Vrex military planning was almost funny to them. Jake's expression did not change. "I'm just suggesting that—" "You are suggesting nothing," Zethkar interrupted. "You are a member of the weakest species in this coalition. Your people have been fighting wars for what, a few thousand years? My ancestors were perfecting the art of battle when your world was covered in ice. You have no natural armor, no enhanced strength. No advanced technology. The only reason you are here at all is because your species breeds quickly enough to replace the casualties. The silence in the room was thick and uncomfortable. Captain Cameron's jaw was tight with anger, but she said nothing. The other human soldiers stood perfectly still, their faces showing no emotion. Humans are useful for simple tasks, Zethkar continued, warming to his subject. You can carry supplies, operate basic equipment, and fill gaps in our formations, but tactical planning, strategic thinking, these require intelligence and experience that your species simply does not possess. He turned to address the other commanders, gesturing dismissively at the humans. Look at them. They carry chemical projectile weapons because they cannot handle energy weapons properly. They wear simple armor because their bodies cannot support anything heavier. They require constant resupply of food and water because they cannot adapt to different environments. In battle, they panic, they break formation, they make emotional decisions instead of logical ones. Several of the alien commanders nodded in agreement. The mantids clicked their mandibles in what passed for approval among their species. Even the usually diplomatic ethereals seemed to accept Zethkar's assessment. The power grid mission is perfect for them, the general continued. It is simple, direct, and if they fail, it will not affect the main operation. At best, they might succeed and provide a minor advantage. At worst, they will die quickly, and we will proceed with our original plan. Jake Martinez listened to all of this without changing expression. His teammates showed similar control, though Captain Cameron's hands had formed fists at her sides. When Zethkar finished speaking, Jake simply nodded. Understood, sir. My team will infiltrate the lower levels and disable the power grid according to your timeline. Zethkar seemed almost disappointed that the human had not argued further. Good. Your orders are simple. Enter through Maintenance Shaft 7, proceed to Power Level 3, and destroy the main generators. The approach is dangerous and you will likely encounter heavy resistance, but the mission must be completed. Will we have backup support if things go wrong? Captain Cameron asked. The general's laugh was like the sound of grinding stone. Captain, if things go wrong in the lower levels, there will not be time for backup support. The fortress defenses will respond within minutes. Your people will either complete the mission or they will die trying. Those are the only two options. Jake studied the holographic display one more time. The route to the power grid did indeed pass through multiple defensive positions. The automated weapon systems would be programmed to kill anything that moved through those corridors. His team would be outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped underground with no easy way to retreat. We'll get it done, Jake said simply. General Zethkar dismissed the humans with a wave of his hand. As they filed out of the briefing room, he turned back to his hologram and began discussing the real tactics with his alien officers. The human mission was just a distraction, a way to keep the weakest members of the coalition busy while the actual warriors won the battle. Captain Cameron caught Jake's arm as they walked down the corridor toward their quarters. Jake, you don't have to prove anything to that arrogant lizard. We can request a different assignment. Jake shook his head. No, Captain. We'll take the mission. Sometimes the best way to deal with someone who thinks they know everything is to show them what they don't know. His eyes had a dangerous glint that Captain Cameron had seen before. It was the look Jake got when he was planning something that would either be brilliant or completely insane. Often both. In 6 hours, they would find out which one it would be this time. The small stealth craft drifted silently through space toward the asteroid fortress. Inside, 6 human soldiers prepared their equipment for what everyone expected to be a suicide mission. The craft was barely large enough for their team and had no weapons or heavy armor. It was designed to avoid detection, not to fight. Jake Martinez checked his rifle one final time. The weapon was simple compared to the energy blasters that other species used, but it was reliable. Human weapons might be primitive, but they worked in conditions that would disable more advanced technology. Next to him, Tony Garcia sorted through his demolition supplies with practiced efficiency. You sure about this plan, Sarge? Tony asked quietly. He was shorter than Jake, with dark hair and quick hands that were perfect for working with explosives. That general wasn't exactly subtle about thinking we're all going to die down there. The general thinks he knows everything, Jake replied. That's his weakness. Amy Foster looked up from her portable computer terminal. She was the team's technology specialist, though her equipment seemed basic compared to what the ethereals used. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and her green eyes were focused on the fortress schematics. "I've been studying their security systems," she said. "The good news is that most of their defenses are designed to stop Vrek shock troops or mantid warriors. The bad news is that they still have enough firepower to turn us into paste." Carl Brooks didn't look up from his sniper rifle. He was tall and thin with steady hands and the kind of patience that made him perfect for long-range shooting. "How many hostiles are we looking at?" "Sensor readings show at least 200 Kethmore shock troops inside the fortress," Amy answered. "Plus automated defenses, security drones, and probably some surprises that aren't showing up on our scans." Lucy. Turner finished checking her medical supplies and looked around at her teammates. She was the smallest member of the squad but had saved more lives than anyone wanted to count. Her brown eyes were calm despite the dangerous mission ahead. "If we stick to the plan and watch each other's backs, we'll make it through," she said, with quiet confidence. The pilot's voice came over the intercom. 60 seconds to drop zone. Maintenance shaft 7 is directly below us. Once you're inside, you're on your own until extraction." Jake stood and moved to the airlock. "Remember, this isn't about proving anything to General Zethkar. This is about completing the mission and getting home alive. We go in quiet. We hit the power grid and we get out. Simple." The other 5 soldiers nodded and gathered around the airlock. They had worked together for 3 years and trusted each other completely. In 30 seconds, they would find out if that trust was enough to keep them alive. The stealth craft shuddered slightly as it made contact with the asteroid's surface. Jake opened the airlock and looked down into Maintenance Shaft 7. It was a narrow tunnel that led into the heart of the fortress. Emergency lighting cast strange shadows on the metal walls. "Here we go," Jake said and dropped into the tunnel. The shaft was barely wide enough for one person. Jake moved carefully, testing each surface before putting his full weight on it. Behind him, his team followed in single file. Amy had her scanner out, checking for electronic surveillance. Carl kept his rifle ready for any surprises ahead. Tony carried his explosives in a pack that was designed to survive almost anything. Lucy brought up the rear, watching for threats from behind. After 10 minutes of crawling through the maintenance tunnel, they reached the fortress interior. Jake carefully opened an access panel and looked out into a corridor. The walls were made of dark metal and covered with alien writing. Strange blue lights provided illumination that was too dim for most species, but perfect for human eyes. "Clear," Jake whispered into his comm unit. The team emerged from the tunnel one by one. They were now inside the fortress, but they were still 3 levels away from the power grid. According to the schematics Amy had studied, they would have to pass through multiple security checkpoints and at least 2 areas that were heavily patrolled. Jake signaled for the team to move forward. They stayed close to the walls and used hand signals to communicate. Human soldiers had learned long ago that sometimes the best way to avoid detection was to move like prey instead of predators. The first security checkpoint appeared around a corner. It was an automated scanner that would detect any large metal objects or energy weapons. Most coalition soldiers carried equipment that would trigger the alarm immediately, but Jake had planned for this. "Amy, can you loop the sensor feed?" he asked quietly. Amy pulled out a small device that looked like a basic radio. "Give me 30 seconds, she whispered, connecting wires to a panel near the scanner. While Amy worked, the rest of the team watched for patrols. Carl positioned himself where he could cover both directions of the corridor. Tony prepared a small explosive charge in case they needed to create a distraction. Lucy kept her medical scanner active, monitoring everyone's vital signs for stress or injury. "Done," Amy said. "The scanner will show an empty corridor for the next 5 minutes." The team moved through the checkpoint without triggering any alarms. They were deeper in the fortress now, but Jake knew the real challenges were still ahead. The Kethmore shock troops would be patrolling the lower levels, and they were known for their brutal efficiency in combat. As they descended to the second level, Jake heard the sound of heavy footsteps echoing through the corridors. He held up his hand and the team froze in place. Through a doorway ahead, Jake could see 4 Kethmore warriors walking patrol. They were massive creatures with thick armor and energy weapons that could cut through steel. The Kethmore were talking in their harsh language as they walked. They seemed relaxed, confident that nothing could threaten them inside their own fortress. Jake watched them carefully, studying their movement patterns and equipment. After a few minutes, the patrol moved on to another section. "They're following a standard patrol route," Jake whispered to his team. 15-minute intervals, same path every time. We can work with that." Tony grinned. Predictable enemies are dead enemies. They continued moving through the fortress, staying ahead of patrols and avoiding automated defenses. Amy used her equipment to disable security cameras and sensors. Carl scouted ahead, using his training to spot ambush points and hidden threats. Tony planted small charges at strategic locations, not to cause damage but to create noise and confusion, if they needed to escape quickly. When they reached the 3rd level, Jake realized that their intelligence had been wrong. The corridor that was supposed to be lightly defended was actually crowded with Kethmore warriors. There were at least 20 of them, all heavily armed and alert. "New plan," Jake said quietly. "We can't fight through that many hostiles. Amy, is there another route to the power grid?" Amy checked her scanner and the fortress schematics. "There's a maintenance route through the air circulation system. It's narrow and it goes right over the power grid chamber, but it's unguarded." "How narrow?" Carl asked. "Narrow enough that most species couldn't fit through it," Amy replied. "But we're smaller than average for coalition soldiers." Jake smiled grimly. For the first time since the mission began, being considered weak and small by other species was actually an advantage. "Lead the way." The maintenance route was even more cramped than the original entry tunnel. The team had to crawl on their bellies through metal ducts that were barely 2 feet high. The air was hot and filled with the smell of recycled atmosphere. But they were making progress toward their target. As they crawled through the ducts, Jake could hear the sounds of the fortress around them. Machinery hummed in the walls. Kethmore voices echoed from the corridors below. Somewhere above them, automated systems monitored the asteroid's defenses. The fortress was a living thing, and they were moving through its veins like a virus. After an hour of crawling, Amy held up her hand. "We're directly over the power grid chamber," she whispered. "I can see the main generators through this grate." Jake moved up beside her and looked down. The power grid chamber was enormous, filled with massive generators that provided energy for the entire fortress. There were only 6 Kethmore guards, but they were positioned to watch all the entrances. The generators themselves were protected by energy shields that would stop most weapons. "This is going to be tricky," Jake said. "We need to get down there, disable the guards, and destroy the generators without triggering every alarm in the fortress." "I have an idea," Tony said with a dangerous smile. "But you're not going to like it." Jake looked at his demolitions expert and sighed. Tony's ideas usually worked, but they were rarely safe or quiet. Still, they had come too far to turn back. "Now, let's hear it," Jake said. As Tony began explaining his plan, Jake realized that General Zethkar had been right about one thing. This mission was probably going to get them all killed. But the general had been wrong about something much more important. Humans might be weak and small and primitive, but they were also stubborn enough to keep fighting even when victory seemed impossible. And sometimes, that was enough. Tony Garcia's plan was simple and completely insane. He wanted to drop through the ventilation grate directly into the middle of 6 heavily armed Kethmore warriors, create enough chaos to let his teammates get into position, and somehow survive long enough for them to complete the mission. "You want to do what?" Carl whispered, staring at Tony like he had lost his mind. "Look, it's basic misdirection," Tony explained quietly. "They're expecting an attack from the corridors. They're not watching the ceiling. I drop down, throw some flashbang grenades, and roll behind the main generator. While they're shooting at me, you guys come down and take them out from behind." Jake studied the chamber below them. The 6 Kethmore guards were positioned to cover all the entrances, but Tony was right. None of them were looking up. The creatures were over 7 feet tall with thick armor and energy rifles that could punch through steel. But they were also overconfident, just like their general had been. It could work, Amy said thoughtfully. If we time it right. I can disable the alarm system for about 60 seconds before their backup sensors come online. Lucy shook her head. Tony, those things will tear you apart the second you hit the ground. Not if I'm fast enough, Tony replied with a grin. Besides, someone has to go first, might as well be me. Jake made his decision. We do it. But we modify the plan. Tony goes first, but Carl drops down 10 seconds later to provide covering. Fire. Amy and Lucy take the left side, I'll take the right. We hit them from 4 directions at once. The team spent the next few minutes preparing. Amy connected her equipment to the fortress security system and waited for Jake's signal. Carl checked his rifle and positioned himself over the chambers. Left corner. Lucy prepared medical supplies in case things went wrong. Tony attached his equipment harness and got ready to drop into what was probably going to be the most dangerous 60 seconds of his life. Remember, Jake said quietly, we're not trying to prove anything, we just need to complete the mission and get home. Tony nodded and positioned himself over the ventilation grate. See you on the other side, Sarge. Jake gave the signal. Amy disabled the alarm system. Tony kicked out the grate and dropped into the chamber below. What happened next was something that would be talked about in coalition military circles for years afterward. Tony landed in the center of the chamber and immediately threw 3 flashbang grenades in different directions. The brilliant light and deafening noise stunned the Kethmore guards just long enough for Tony to roll behind the nearest generator. Carl dropped through the grate 10 seconds later, his rifle already firing. His first shot took down a Kethmore warrior who was trying to flank Tony's position. His second shot disabled another warrior's weapon. By the time Carl hit the ground, 2 of the 6 guards were out of action. Amy and Lucy came through the grate on the left side of the chamber. Amy carried a modified energy pistol that she had rebuilt from spare parts. It wasn't as powerful as military weapons, but it was reliable and quiet. Lucy had her medical scanner in one hand and a projectile pistol in the other. Jake dropped last, landing behind the remaining guards. His rifle fired in controlled bursts, each shot carefully aimed. Human weapons might be primitive, but in the hands of someone who knew how to use them, they were deadly effective. The entire fight lasted less than 30 seconds. When the smoke cleared, all 6 Kethmore guards were down. Tony emerged from behind the generator with a few burns on his armor but otherwise unharmed. Carl was already moving to secure the chamber entrances. Amy was working on the generator control systems. How much time do we have? Jake asked. The backup alarms will come online in 40 seconds, Amy replied, without looking up from her work. But I'm having trouble with these controls. The power grid system is more complex than our intelligence suggested. Lucy finished checking Tony for injuries and moved to help Amy. What's the problem? The generators are linked together in a way that wasn't shown on our schematics, Amy explained. If I just destroy them randomly, the system will shift power to the backup generators in another part of the fortress. We need to disable them in a specific sequence. Jake looked at the massive generators that filled the chamber. Each one was the size of a small building and protected by energy shields. Even with Tony's explosives, destroying them would take time they didn't have. Can you figure out the sequence? He asked Amy. Give me 2 minutes, she replied, her fingers flying over the alien control panels. We don't have 2 minutes, Carl said from his position by the entrance. I can hear footsteps in the corridor, company's coming. Jake made a quick decision. Tony, start placing charges on the generators, use everything you have. Amy, keep working on those controls. Carl and Lucy, watch the entrances. If anything comes through those doors, stop it. The team moved with practiced efficiency. Tony pulled explosive charges from his pack and began attaching them to the generator housings. The energy shields prevented him from getting close to the vital components, but he could damage the support systems. Amy continued working on the control panels, trying to understand alien technology that was centuries more advanced than anything humans had built. The sound of footsteps grew louder. Jake could hear Kethmore voices in the corridor outside. They had discovered the bodies of the guards and were organizing a response. In a few minutes, the chamber would be flooded with enemy soldiers. Got it, Amy suddenly exclaimed. The generators have to be shut down in reverse order of their installation. If I disable generator 6 first, then 5, then 4, the whole system will cascade failure without switching to backup power. How long will that take? Jake asked. 3 minutes if everything goes perfectly, Amy replied. Carl looked back from the entrance. Sarge, we've got maybe 1 minute before they breach this chamber. There are at least 20 hostiles out there, probably more. Jake looked around the chamber. There was no other way out except the ventilation shaft they had used to enter, and climbing back up would take too long. They were trapped in a room with no cover except the generators themselves, facing overwhelming odds. It was exactly the kind of impossible situation that General Zethkar expected humans to fail at. The kind of scenario where logical, experienced, military commanders would retreat and find another approach. The kind of fight that was supposed to prove that humans were too weak and emotional to handle real combat. New plan, Jake said calmly. Amy, keep working on those generators. Tony, when she gives the signal, blow the charges. Carl and Lucy, we're going to hold this chamber until the mission is complete. Sarge, Lucy said quietly. That's suicide. There are too many of them. Maybe, Jake replied. But we're not leaving without completing the mission. That's what we came here to do. The sound of footsteps stopped outside the chamber. Jake could hear the Kethmore warriors preparing for their assault. They would probably throw in grenades. First, then charge through the entrances with overwhelming firepower. It was a sound tactical approach that should have guaranteed victory. But the Kethmore had made the same mistake as their general. They thought they understood what they were fighting. They expected humans to panic, to break formation, to make emotional decisions that would get them killed. They were planning for enemies who would act predictably and logically. They were not planning for humans who were too stubborn to give up and too creative to fight fair. Jake smiled grimly and checked his rifle one more time. Amy, how much longer on those generators? 2 minutes and 30 seconds, she replied, sweat beading on her forehead as she worked. Tony, are the charges ready? Ready when she is, Sarge. Carl, Lucy, you know what to do. The chamber doors exploded inward as the Kethmore assault began. Energy blasts filled the air as 20 heavily armed warriors poured into the room. They expected to find 6 terrified humans cowering behind inadequate cover. Instead, they found something much more dangerous. They found humans who had decided that failure was not an option, no matter what the odds looked like. And for the first time since the mission began, Jake Martinez smiled like he was actually enjoying himself. The real fight was about to begin. The first wave of Kethmore warriors charged through the chamber doors expecting easy targets. Instead, they found themselves in a killing field that Jake Martinez had turned into a maze of deadly surprises. The human team had used the generator, housings as cover, but not in the way any military manual would suggest. Carl Brooks was positioned on top of Generator 3, using his sniper rifle to pick off enemies as they entered. His elevated position gave him clear shots at targets who thought they were safely behind cover. Each bullet found its mark with precision that seemed impossible given the chaos around him. Lucy Turner had taken position near the main control panel, but she wasn't just hiding. She was using her medical scanner to track the life signs of approaching enemies through the walls. Every time a Kethmore warrior tried to flank their position, Lucy would call out his location to her teammates. Tony Garcia had done something that defied all logic. Instead of staying behind cover, he was moving through the chamber like a ghost, placing small explosive charges on the walls and floor. Every few seconds, one of his charges would detonate behind enemy lines, forcing the Kethmore to constantly worry about threats from directions they thought were secure. And Amy Foster continued working on the generator controls, her fingers flying over alien interfaces while energy blasts scorched the air around her. She had figured out that the fortress's automated systems were designed to respond to different alien species in predictable ways. But humans were not in the system's database. Generator 6 is offline, Amy shouted over the sound of gunfire. Starting sequence for Generator 5. Jake moved between the generators with fluid grace, his rifle picking off targets that his teammates couldn't reach. But he wasn't just fighting. He was thinking, analyzing the battle as it unfolded, looking for patterns and weaknesses that he could exploit. The Kethmore were experienced warriors, but they fought like most military species did. They used overwhelming firepower and superior numbers to crush their enemies. They expected their opponents to either flee or die quickly. They were not prepared for humans who refused to do either. "They're trying to circle around the left flank," Lucy called out, reading the life signs on her scanner. "I see them," Carl replied, swinging his rifle toward the new threat. His shot took down the lead warrior and forced the others back into cover. Tony's voice came over the comm system. "Sarge, I've got an idea. These generators are connected to the fortress's main power grid, right? What if we don't just destroy them? What if we overload them?" Jake ducked behind Generator 4 as energy blasts scorched the air where his head had been. "What are you thinking?" "If Amy can reverse the power flow instead of just shutting down the generators, we could send a feedback pulse through the entire fortress electrical system. It won't destroy everything, but it'll definitely get their attention." Amy looked up from her work for just a moment. "That's completely insane. The power surge could kill us all. But would it work?" Jake asked. "Probably," Amy admitted. "The generators have safety systems, but they're designed to protect against normal equipment failures. They're not built to handle deliberate sabotage." Jake made his decision while reloading his rifle. "Do it. How long do you need?" 3 more minutes for the shutdown sequence, then another 2 minutes to reverse the power flow. 5 minutes, Jake said to his team. "We hold this position for 5 more minutes." The Kethmore seemed to sense that something was changing. Their attacks became more desperate, more coordinated. They brought up heavier weapons and started firing at the generators themselves, trying to destroy the humans' cover. Carl had to abandon his elevated position when energy blasts started melting the generator housing beneath him. He dropped to ground level and took cover behind a control panel, but his field of fire was much more limited now. Lucy moved closer to Amy, using her body to shield the tech specialist from incoming fire. She had drawn her sidearm and was returning fire when targets presented themselves, but her main job was keeping Amy alive long enough to complete the sabotage. Tony's explosive charges were running low, but he had started using pieces of the fortress against itself. He rigged sections of the ceiling to collapse, creating barriers that forced the Kethmore to take longer routes to their positions. He turned maintenance panels into improvised claymore mines that would detonate when enemies passed by. Jake found himself in the center of the chamber, completely exposed but somehow still alive. He was moving constantly, never staying in one place long enough for enemy fire to find him. His rifle was running low on ammunition, but every shot still counted. "Generator 5 is offline," Amy announced. "Starting sequence for Generator 4. The lights in the chamber flickered as the fortress's power systems began to feel the strain. Emergency lighting activated, casting strange red shadows across the battlefield. The Kethmore warriors seemed confused by the changing conditions, but they kept attacking. "How many hostiles are left?" Jake called out during a brief lull in the fighting. 12, maybe 15, Carl replied. "But more are coming. I can hear them in the corridors." Jake looked around the chamber. His team was still alive, but they were running out of ammunition, cover, and time. The mission was almost complete, but they needed to survive just a little longer. That was when Jake noticed something that changed everything. The fortress's automated defense systems were starting to malfunction as Amy's sabotage affected the power grid. Security cameras were shutting down. Motion sensors were giving false readings. The environmental systems that regulated air pressure and temperature were becoming unstable. "Amy!" Jake shouted. "The automated defenses, can you turn them against the Kethmore?" Amy's eyes widened as she understood what Jake was suggesting. "The security system is tied into the same power grid I'm sabotaging. If I can reroute some of the system protocols." She turned back to her controls with renewed intensity. While her teammates continued fighting, Amy dove into the fortress's computer systems. She didn't try to hack them the way an ethereal tech specialist would, with elegant code and sophisticated algorithms. Instead, she attacked the system like a human would, finding weak points and exploiting them with brute force creativity. "Generator 4 is offline," she announced. "And I think I've got something here." Suddenly, the chamber's automated defense turrets activated. But instead of targeting the humans, they began firing at the Kethmore warriors. The aliens found themselves caught between human soldiers who refused to die and their own security systems that no longer recognized them as friendly. "Generator 3 is offline," Amy called out. 2 more to go. The remaining Kethmore warriors tried to retreat, but Tony had blocked most of the exits with debris from his explosive charges. They were trapped in a chamber with malfunctioning defenses, determined humans, and a power grid that was about to experience catastrophic failure. Carl picked off 3 more enemies as they tried to find new cover. Lucy treated a minor wound on Tony's arm while continuing to track hostile movements. Jake coordinated the defense while watching Amy work, knowing that everything depended on her completing the sequence. "Generator 2 is offline," Amy shouted. "Starting final sequence." That was when the fortress's main defense systems detected the sabotage and tried to compensate. Backup generators came online throughout the asteroid. Emergency protocols activated. Security teams from other sections began moving toward the power grid chamber. But Amy had anticipated this. As she initiated the final shutdown sequence, she also triggered Tony's remaining explosive charges throughout the chamber. The combined effect of the power overload and the explosions created a cascade failure that spread through the fortress's entire electrical system. The lights went out. The automated defenses stopped functioning. The environmental systems shut down. In the space of 30 seconds, Amy Foster had turned one of the most heavily defended fortresses in this sector of space into a dark, powerless tomb. "Generator 1 is offline," Amy announced in the sudden darkness. "Mission complete." Jake activated his flashlight and looked around the chamber. The surviving Kethmore warriors were retreating in confusion, no longer able to coordinate their attacks without their equipment. His team was battered but alive, and they had accomplished something that General Zethkar had considered impossible. But Jake knew their real test was just beginning. Now they had to fight their way out of a disabled fortress filled with angry enemies who wanted revenge. And they had to do it in the dark with limited ammunition and no support from the outside. It was exactly the kind of impossible situation that humans specialized in surviving. The fortress was completely dark. Emergency lighting flickered randomly as damaged systems tried to restart themselves. In the power grid chamber, Jake Martinez used his flashlight to check on his team. They were all alive, though Tony had burns on his arms and Carl was limping from a piece of shrapnel in his leg. "Sound off," Jake said quietly. "Amy here. Systems are down and staying down. We did it." Tony reporting, low on explosives but still breathing. "Carl's good to go. Leg hurts, but I can still walk. Lucy's fine. Tony and Carl need medical attention when we get back to the ship." Jake nodded in the darkness. They had completed their mission, but now they faced the challenge of getting out alive. The fortress was filled with confused and angry Kethmore, warriors who would be looking for someone to blame for the power failure. "What's our extraction route?" Amy asked, packing up her equipment. "The way we came in," Jake replied. "The maintenance shafts should still be clear, and without power, most of the automated defenses will be offline." They began moving through the darkened chamber, using their flashlights sparingly to avoid attracting attention. In the distance, they could hear Kethmore voices shouting orders and the sound of heavy footsteps as search teams tried to organize. In the darkness, the team reached the ventilation shaft that had brought them into the chamber. Carl went first despite his injured leg, followed by Lucy and Amy. Tony and Jake brought up the rear, watching for pursuit. As they crawled through the narrow maintenance tunnels, Jake's radio crackled with incoming transmissions. General Zethkar's voice came through clearly, speaking to his fleet commanders. "All units report status. The fortress appears to have suffered a complete power failure." Jake listened as the alien commanders responded. The main assault had been struggling against heavy resistance until the moment the lights went out. Suddenly, defensive turrets had stopped firing, security doors had opened, and the fortress's shields had collapsed. "Sir, my ground teams report that all primary objectives have been secured," came a Vrex officer's voice. "Resistance has collapsed completely. Whatever happened to their power grid, it worked perfectly." There was a long pause before General Zethkar replied. "Status report on the human infiltration team. No contact since they entered the fortress, sir. Assumed lost." Jake almost smiled as he continued crawling through the maintenance shaft. The general had written them off as dead, just as he had expected them to fail from the beginning. In a few minutes, Zethkar was going to get a very surprising update. The team emerged from the ventilation system on the fortress's upper level. Through the windows, they could see Zethkar's assault ships moving toward the asteroid. The main battle was over, and the coalition forces had won a complete victory. "Extraction point is 200 meters north," Jake said, checking his position. "Stay together and watch for stragglers." They moved through the fortress corridors, carefully. Most of the Kethmore forces had either been captured or had retreated to defensive positions near the command center. The humans encountered only scattered resistance as they made their way toward the extraction point. When they reached the surface, their extraction craft was waiting exactly where it was supposed to be. The pilot's voice came over the radio with obvious relief. "Martinez team, this is Eagle 6. We've been waiting for your signal. Status report?" "Mission accomplished," Jake replied. "All team members alive and mobile. Request immediate extraction." As the small craft lifted off from the asteroid's surface, Jake looked back at the fortress they had just escaped. Without power, it looked like a dead rock floating in space. It was hard to believe that just an hour ago, it had been one of the most heavily defended positions in this sector. The flight back to the Stellar Dawn took 20 minutes. During the trip, Jake listened to radio chatter from the other assault teams. Everyone was celebrating the victory, but there was confusion about how the fortress's defenses had failed so completely. When their craft docked with the main ship, Jake and his team were escorted directly to the briefing room. General Zethkar was waiting for them, along with several other coalition commanders. The alien general's expression was unreadable as the humans filed into the room. "Sergeant Martinez," Zethkar said slowly, "I was told your team was lost during the infiltration." "We completed our mission, sir," Jake replied simply. "The power grid has been destroyed." Zethkar studied the humans carefully. They were tired and dirty from their time in the fortress, but they were all alive. Tony's arms were bandaged from his burns, and Carl was favoring his injured leg, but they stood at attention with quiet professionalism. "Explain to me exactly what happened down there," the general commanded. For the next 30 minutes, Jake gave a detailed report of their mission. He described the infiltration route, the encounter with the guards, and the final battle in the power grid chamber. He spoke calmly and factually, without exaggerating or dramatizing their actions. The other alien commanders listened with growing amazement. The humans had accomplished something that military analysts had calculated would require at least 50 elite Vrex warriors. They had adapted to unknown technologies, overcome superior numbers, and completed their mission despite facing odds that should have guaranteed their destruction. When Jake finished his report, the briefing room was silent. General Zethkar stared at the humans for a long moment before speaking. "You destroyed 6 generators that were protected by energy shields and defended by 20 Kethmore shock troops," he said slowly. "You accomplished this with primitive weapons and basic equipment." "Yes, sir," Jake replied. "And you did this while being outnumbered more than 3-1. "Yes, sir. Using tactics that are not taught in any military academy in known space." Jake hesitated for a moment. "We improvised, sir. The situation required creative solutions." Zethkar stood up from his chair and walked around the table to face Jake directly. The massive alien general towered over the human sergeant, but Jake met his gaze steadily. "Sergeant Martinez, I owe you and your team an apology," Zethkar said in a voice that carried to every corner of the room. "I underestimated your capabilities. I judged your species by standards that do not apply to human soldiers." The other alien commanders shifted uncomfortably. It was almost unheard of for a Vrex general to admit error, especially to members of what they considered an inferior species. "Sir, we were just doing our job," Jake replied. "No," Zethkar said firmly. "What you did today went far beyond duty. You accomplished the impossible because you refused to accept that it was impossible. You turned your apparent weaknesses into strengths. You fought with honor and intelligence against overwhelming odds." The general turned to address the other commanders. "I have been a soldier for over 200 years. I have seen the finest warriors that our species can produce. But today, I learned something new about the nature of strength." He looked back at Jake and his team. "True strength is not about natural advantages or superior technology. It is about the refusal to surrender when victory seems impossible. It is about finding hope in hopeless situations and turning disadvantages into weapons. Zethkar extended one clawed hand toward Jake. Sergeant Martinez, I would be honored to have you serve as my tactical advisor for future operations. Your insights could save many lives and win battles that we might otherwise lose. Jake looked at the offered hand, then at his teammates. They all nodded slightly, understanding that this moment represented something much larger than just their mission. I would be honored to serve, sir, Jake said, grasping the alien general's hand. As the briefing concluded and the teams were dismissed, Jake overheard two alien officers talking near the doorway. How did they do it? One asked. How? Did 6 humans accomplish what we thought was impossible? Jake paused and turned back to them. We learned a long time ago that survival isn't about being the strongest or the smartest, he said quietly. It's about being too stubborn to give up and too creative to accept that something can't be done. As Jake walked toward his quarters, he thought about General Zethkar's words. The alien commander had finally understood something important about humans. They might be physically weaker than other species and their technology might be primitive, but they possessed something that could not be measured or replicated. They had the ability to look at impossible situations and find ways to make them possible. They had the stubborn determination to keep fighting when logic said they should surrender. And they had the creativity to turn any disadvantage into a weapon if they thought about it long enough. In the end, that was what made humans dangerous. Not their strength or their weapons, but their absolute refusal to accept that anything was truly impossible.